Started the foundation today. Dug the footings by hand. 4 corners, 16 inches deep. The ground up here is rocky, but it drains well. Nobody around but the hawks. That suits me fine. Those words were written in March of 1962 by a man named Edmund Harmon. He was 32 years old. He was alone on a mountain in the Blue Ridge Range of western North Carolina, and he had nothing left but his hands and a piece of land he had cleared himself. He wrote those words in a leather journal by lamplight, and then he set the journal down and went back to digging. He did not know that 62 years later, a 23-year-old woman would sit in a lawyer's office in Raleigh and receive as her entire share of her dead husband's estate the key to the cabin he built on that mountain. He did not know her name. He did not know anything about her. But in a way that would take her months to fully understand, Edmund Harmon had been waiting for her. The lawyer's office was on the second floor of a brick building on the main road downtown. The carpet was the color of old coffee. A water stain marked the ceiling tiles directly above the conference table, a brown ring spreading outward like something slow and patient. The room smelled like recycled air and paper that had been filed and refiled for decades. Sylvie Dunning sat closest to the door. She wore a black dress she had borrowed from a coworker at the hospital because the one she owned no longer fit the way it used to. She had lost weight in the 8 months since Colt died. Not deliberately. The kind of weight that goes when grief takes your appetite with it and doesn't give it back. The dress was slightly too large across the shoulders, and she had pinned the back seam with a safety pin she found in the bottom of her purse. Nobody could see it, but she knew it was there. Her purse sat on the floor beside her feet. $47 inside it. A granola bar. A phone with 12% battery. Lorraine Harmon arrived first. She walked into the conference room the way she walked into every room she considered hers, which was every room she entered. She set her handbag on the chair beside her before she sat down, claiming the space on both sides. Then she folded her hands on the table and looked at the wall across from her as if she were already waiting for something that was taking too long. Garrett came in behind her, scrolling through his phone with his thumb. He sat across from his mother without looking up. He had a sport jacket on over a pale blue shirt, and the jacket had the kind of easy fit that comes from a tailor who knows his client's measurements by memory. He crossed one ankle over the other knee and kept scrolling. Neither of them looked at Sylvie. She had been Colt's wife for 3 years. She had sat at their dinner tables and learned the particular silence of a family that communicates in exclusions. She had figured out early that the Harmon family had a grammar of its own and that she had never been taught it, and that the teaching was not forthcoming. So she had learned to read the grammar from the outside. The way Lorraine placed her handbag told you more than anything she said. The way Garrett held his phone told you whether the news in the room was going his way. Sylvie had become a fluent reader of everything they chose not to say. She sat quietly and kept her hands in her lap and waited. The lawyer was a thin man with wire-rimmed reading glasses he kept pushing up his nose. He opened a manila folder with the careful motions of a man who performs careful motions professionally, and he cleared his throat once and he began. The house on Birch Lane. The house where Colt had grown up, where Sylvie had spent 3 years trying to make herself invisible enough to be tolerated at family dinners. Awarded to Lorraine Harmon as surviving family custodian. The savings account. $11,400, which was every dollar Colt had managed to put aside across 6 years of working longer hours than his body was built for. Awarded to Garrett Harmon as executor of the family trust. The sedan. Still 6 payments from being paid off. Awarded to Lorraine. The tools from Colt's workshop in the garage. Absorbed into the family estate. The books from the shelf in their bedroom that Colt had read and reread, and sometimes quoted aloud on Sunday mornings with coffee in his hand. Absorbed into the estate. The guitar. The one he played on the front porch the night he proposed to her, sitting on the top step with the summer dark all around them, playing a song he'd learned specifically for that moment, and playing it slightly wrong and not caring. The guitar went to the estate along with everything else folded into the holdings of a family he had belonged to by birth and she had belonged to by marriage. And there was apparently a difference, and the difference was the entire point. Lorraine uncrossed and recrossed her legs. Garrett glanced up from his phone long enough to check whether they were close to finished. The lawyer turned a page. One remaining asset, he said. A parcel of land in Henderson County, one structure on the property, 4 acres total, county tax appraisal. He paused for less than a second, the way people pause before a number they find awkward to say. $3. Garrett laughed. It was not a subtle laugh. It filled the room in the way a laugh will when the person laughing wants everyone in the room to understand the scale of their amusement. $3, he said. That's great, Granddad's old shack. Lorraine's expression shifted slightly just at the corners. That cabin has been sitting empty for 30 years, she said. Edmund mentioned it once to Colt when Colt was a child. Something about wanting to fix it up eventually. She said it the way people describe things that were never going to happen. She reached into her handbag and produced a key. Brass heavy for its size with a small paper tag tied to it with a thin cord. The tag read HC7 in faded ink, the letters slightly smeared as if written long ago with a pen running low. She set the key on the table and slid it across towards Sylvie with one finger. Your share, she said. Sylvie looked at the key on the polished wood. She looked at the paper tag. She looked at the number written on it, which was not a dollar amount but a property code, and she thought about the other number she had just heard. $11,400. The house on Birch Lane. 6 remaining car payments. A guitar. What am I supposed to do with a $3 cabin, she said. That is entirely up to you. Lorraine's voice was patient in the way that patience can be its own kind of sharpness. The family felt it was important that you receive something. Garrett leaned back in his chair. That cabin was worthless before any of us were born, he said. The county tried to condemn it twice and gave up because it wasn't worth the gas to drive out there. The lawyer took his glasses off and cleaned them on his tie. He did not say anything, but his jaw tightened in the way jaws tighten when a person is maintaining professional neutrality at some effort to themselves. Sylvie reached across the table and picked up the key. It was cold, heavier than it looked. She closed her fingers around it and felt the weight of it settle into her palm. Where is it, she asked. Past Asheville, Lorraine said. Up some mountain. I've never been. About 3 hours from here, the lawyer said. He wrote an address on a yellow sticky note and pushed it across the table. The road is unpaved for the last mile. Garrett stood up and buttoned his jacket in the particular way of someone who considers the meeting successfully concluded. Lorraine gathered her handbag. She walked out of the conference room without looking at Sylvie. Not a glance. Not a word. As if Sylvie had already ceased to occupy the same plane of existence as people who mattered. Garrett followed. Their footsteps moved down the hallway and faded, and then the sound of the elevator reached her from somewhere beyond the wall. The lawyer came back a minute later. He stood in the doorway. Is there anything you need, Mrs. Harmon? He asked. She almost corrected him. Dunning. She had been Sylvie Dunning before she married into that family, and some days she wished she still was, and other days she didn't know what she wished, which was its own kind of exhausting. No, she said. Thank you. She sat in the empty conference room for 10 more minutes with the key in her hand, staring at the water stain on the ceiling and listening to the muffled sound of a dentist's drill working through the floor below. The drill had a rhythm like an argument. It rose and held and then stopped and then started again. She thought about Colt. She thought about a Sunday morning 6 months before the accident. Both of them still in bed, his arm across her shoulders, the window letting in the kind of gray morning light that makes staying still feel like a reasonable philosophy. He had told her about a cabin his grandfather built in the mountains. He'd gone there as a boy, he said, used to sit on the porch and watch the hawks ride the thermals above the ridge. The man who built it was something else, he said. You had to see what he could do with wood. Nobody in the family understood it. Colt said it like that distance between his grandfather and the rest of the Harmons was something he had thought about for a long time. Maybe we'll go up there sometime, he said, and she said that would be nice. But the weeks filled up the way weeks do and the months went by, and then a truck driver ran a red light on Route 40 on a Tuesday afternoon, and all the Sundays in Sylvie's life went with it. She stood up. She put the key in her purse next to the granola bar and the dying phone. She picked up the sticky note with the address. She left. She drove to the apartment she'd been renting since the funeral. One bedroom above a laundromat on a street that smelled like warm fabric and detergent every morning when she left for her shifts at the hospital. The lease was up at the end of the month. She had not been looking for a new place because she had not had the bandwidth to look. And she had not had the bandwidth to look because working 6-day weeks as a nurse's aide while managing grief was about as much as a person could carry at one time. She pulled a duffel bag from the closet and started packing. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts, her flannel jacket with a torn pocket she'd been meaning to fix since February, her work shoes, a flashlight she'd bought new batteries for the week before because the old ones had finally given out, a sleeping bag she'd found at a thrift store for $8 rolled tight and smelling slightly of someone else's camping trips, a box of granola bars, a bottle of ibuprofen. She counted her money on the kitchen counter, $47 from her purse and $167 from the envelope in her nightstand drawer, which was every dollar she had saved from 8 months of nurse's aide shifts. The envelope had taken a long time to fill. She put it all together in the front pocket of the duffel bag. $214. Everything she had in the world stacked in a pile she could cover with one hand. She left the apartment key on the kitchen counter. The landlord could keep the deposit. She had already done the math and it didn't matter. The drive west took just under 3 hours. She followed the interstate past Raleigh, past Greensboro, and somewhere around Winston-Salem, the land started changing. It lifted. The highway rose and the exits grew farther apart, and the trees got taller and pressed closer to the shoulders of the road. The sky was a different color out here, a deeper blue, the way sky looks when you're high enough that the horizon drops. Past Asheville, the highway narrowed to a 2-lane blacktop that curved through old farmland in small towns with names she didn't recognize. Then the blacktop gave way to a gravel road that wound up into the trees. Then the gravel thinned and became dirt packed hard from years of weather, but rutted from the spring rains, and the trees closed overhead, and the GPS signal on her phone dissolved into a spinning circle that never resolved. She drove slowly. Her tires slipped once on a section of loose stone, and her heart lifted into her chest before the tires caught again. A branch scraped the roof of her car with a sound like a fingernail drawn slowly down a blackboard. There was no mailbox, no house number, no indication that any human being had driven this particular stretch of road in years. Then the trees opened. She stopped the car. The cabin sat at the far end of a clearing backed up against a ridge of hardwoods that rose into the late afternoon sky. The sun was behind the tree line, and the light was the flat gold of an hour before dusk. Vines covered the east wall from ground to eave, a thick, dark green that had been growing undisturbed for decades. The porch sagged visibly at the left corner, one post tilting inward like a man leaning on a bad hip. The windows were dark with grime and cobwebs, opaque with the accumulated neglect of years. But the roof line was straight. She noticed that first. A roof that has failed tells you immediately. It sags at the center or dips at the edges or shows the dark staining of rot working its way through the structure. This roof was even across its entire span. 60 years of rain and snow and ice and wind, and the line was still true. And the walls. The walls were plumb. She didn't have a level, but she knew what a true vertical looked like. And those walls were standing exactly as they had been built to stand. Whoever built this structure had built it to last. Not to last for 10 years, not for 20. To last. She got out of the car. The clearing smelled like pine and something else underneath it, something cooler and older. The particular smell of a place where the sun doesn't reach until midday and the shade holds moisture through the summer. She walked to the porch. The boards creaked under her weight. The left corner was soft, she avoided it. But the rest of the porch held without complaint. The front door stopped her. It was thick, made from a single slab of dark wood, and it was carved. Not just paneled or beveled. Carved. Leaves and vines worked into the surface in a pattern that covered the entire face of the door, the lines so fine and so precisely cut that she ran her fingers across them before she had consciously decided to do so. She stood there with her fingers tracing the surface of the carving, and she thought about how long this must have taken. Not hours, weeks, months maybe. Every line cut by hand by a person who was in no hurry, who had somewhere to be, and had decided that this was the place. She put the key in the lock. It turned on the first try. Not stiffly, not with resistance. It turned smoothly, as if the lock had been oiled recently, as if someone had maintained it, which was impossible because no one had been here in years. She would understand later that Edmund Harmon had built the lock mechanism with the same precision he had built everything else, and that a mechanism built precisely enough will hold its tolerance far longer than the usual lifespan of such things. The door swung inward. Cool air moved past her, dry and still and carrying the deep, clean smell of cedar, not the sharp cedar of a closet freshener, but the real thing, the smell of old timber that has spent decades in a sealed space. She stood in the doorway for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. Then she pulled the flashlight from her bag and switched it on. The beam moved across the room. She stopped moving entirely. The walls were paneled in wood, every surface floor to ceiling covered in handmade wood paneling, finished to a smoothness that caught the flashlight beam and threw it back in warm tones. But it wasn't the smoothness that made her stop. It was the grain. The boards were matched. Every plank had been chosen and positioned so that its grain pattern connected to the grain of the board beside it. The lines of the wood flowing from one surface to the next in a continuous pattern that ran around all four walls like a landscape seen through a window. Someone had sorted through timber looking for the right pieces, had laid them out and arranged them and rearranged them until the pattern worked, then had fixed them to the walls with a care that did not allow for shortcuts. She moved the beam to the fireplace. The mantel was carved from a single piece of timber walnut, by the color of it, dark and rich. The carving ran the full length of the mantel, a vine that grew from the left end and traveled across the entire span to the right, generating flowers and birds and leaves along the way, all of them connected to the central vine, all of them growing from the same source. The detail was extraordinary. She could see the veining in the leaves. She could see the texture of individual petals on the flowers. And everything connected to everything else. Nothing isolated, nothing decorative in the way that decoration usually is, meaning placed there to fill space. This had been placed there because whoever carved it had needed to. She walked to the bed frame. Thick posts turned spindles. A headboard with a pattern of mountain laurel carved into it, the flowers recognizable from the hillsides she'd driven through on the way up. She touched one of the joints where two pieces of the frame met the corner post joining the side rail. No metal, no fasteners of any kind. The wood was fitted together with notches and pegs, the kind of joinery that requires the two pieces to be shaped to match each other exactly, which means the person doing the shaping must be exact. She tried to move the joint, pushed against it. Nothing shifted, not even slightly. After 6 decades of mountain weather, the frame was as solid as the day it was built. She set the flashlight on the small table by the window and turned slowly in its glow, trying to take the room in all at once. A table and 2 chairs, a shelf along the north wall held up by brackets carved to look like open hands, the fingers curved upward as if offering to hold whatever was placed on them. Every piece handmade, every piece still standing exactly as built. She had expected a ruin. She had driven 3 hours expecting rotted floorboards and collapsed infrastructure, and the kind of general structural failure that tells you a building has given up. She had expected the final insult, the punctuation mark, on everything the Harmons had done in that conference room. Here is your share of our son's life. Here is a pile of boards in the mountains that aren't worth the gas it takes to drive to them. This was not that. This was something else entirely, and she didn't have the vocabulary for it yet, but she knew it when she was standing in the middle of it. She unrolled the sleeping bag across the bare bed slats, took off her shoes, and lay down. The frame held her without a sound. Outside, the wind moved through the trees on the ridge. A branch tapped once against the window and then stopped. The carved ceiling was above her, even though she couldn't see it in the dark, and the floor was solid beneath her, and the whole place held together the way good things do when they're built by someone who meant every part of it. She slept better than she had in 8 months. In the morning, she found the light. The windows faced east and south, and when the sun came up, it came through the grime-film glass in pale bands of gold that moved across the floor as the morning progressed. She lay still for a moment, watching the light move. Then she sat up sore from the wood slats and looked at the cabin in daylight for the first time. The paneling caught the morning sun, and the grain came alive in it. Streaks of red-gold heartwood running through darker wood, the color shifting as the light moved. The mantel cast small shadows from its carving, the flowers and birds emerging in low relief against the wall. The floor under its layer of dust was oak hand-planed smooth, the surface marked with the subtle unevenness of work done, without machines, which looked more honest than anything a machine produces. She walked to the window and rubbed a circle in the glass with her sleeve. Outside, the clearing ran to the tree line, and beyond the trees, the ridge dropped into a valley of hardwoods that stretched all the way to the horizon. The fall colors were not yet full, but the trees were beginning to turn, and the valley below was a patchwork of green and early amber. Above the tree line, riding the thermal that ran along the ridge, a hawk worked slow circles in the morning air, just like Colt had described. Years ago in their bed on a gray morning, he had described exactly this. The hawks above the ridge, and he had been right, and now she was here and he was not. And the hawk was still circling the way hawks do, indifferent to the particular complications of human grief. She ate a granola bar by the window, drank water from the bottle in her car, thought about what to do next. She could sell. The appraised value was $3, but she understood that county appraisals of remote properties were often based on minimal inspection, and the structure itself was sounder than most of what she'd seen in that price range. She might get a few hundred, maybe more if she found a buyer who understood what they were looking at. She could take whatever it brought, get a room in Asheville, pick up shifts at a hospital, and start building from scratch with whatever she had left. Or she could stay. She looked at the walls. She looked at the work that had been put into every surface and every joint and every carefully chosen board. She thought about Lorraine's face when she slid the key across the conference table. The expression of a woman performing generosity for the benefit of the lawyer, the thin satisfaction in it, the absolute confidence that she was discarding something of no value. Sylvie changed into jeans and a flannel shirt, rinsed her face with water from the bottle, got in her car and drove down the mountain. The town of Millhaven sat in the valley below the ridge about 12 miles down the mountain road. A gas station, a hardware store, a post office, a diner with a hand-painted sign that had been repainted enough times that the letters had softened at the edges. She parked at the hardware store and went in. The bell above the door made a single note. The man behind the counter looked up from the newspaper he had open on the counter. He was heavy-set, maybe 62, with the kind of face that has spent most of its life outdoors and is comfortable with the results. He wore reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and he had pushed them up onto his forehead. His name in white thread on a navy patch above his breast pocket was Holt. "Help you," he said. "I just moved into a cabin up on the ridge," Sylvie said. "I need a broom, some rags, cleaning supplies." Holt Tanner studied her the way a person studies someone they're trying to place. Not unfriendly, the particular careful attention of a man in a small town who keeps track of the people in it. "Which cabin?" he asked. "Off the dirt road past mile marker 7, stone fireplace. 1 room." He was quiet for a moment. Then he came around the counter and walked her to the cleaning aisle at the back of the store. "That's old Ed Harmon's place," he said. "You knew him," Sylvie said. It wasn't quite a question. Everybody around here knew Ed. He came to town once a month for supplies. Holt handed her a broom, then set a bucket on the floor and began adding rags to it without being asked. He was quiet when he worked, precise and unhurried. "Haven't seen anybody go up there in years. We all figured the family had forgotten about it." They had, Sylvie said. Holt straightened up. He looked at her. Something had shifted in his expression, something careful and evaluating. "You family?" he asked. "I was married to his grandson." "Was." "He passed 8 months ago." Holt was quiet for what felt like a full 10 seconds. Then he nodded once, a small, deliberate motion. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said. He moved to the counter and began ringing up the items. Broom bucket rags cleaner, $14. He added a second bottle of cleaner without changing the price. Ed was a good man, he said as he worked. Quiet. Kept to himself up there on that mountain for the last 20 or 30 years. But if you needed something built or fixed, he'd do it and refuse to take a dollar for it. That was just who he was. Sylvie paid. She picked up the bucket. "You need anything else," Holt said, "come back." She bought a sandwich and a coffee at the diner, ate in her car in the parking lot, watching the mountains, then drove back up. She spent the rest of the day cleaning. She swept the floor first, working from the far wall toward the door, raising clouds of dust so thick she had to stop twice and prop the door open and wait for the air to settle before she could see clearly enough to continue. When the dust settled and she swept it out, the oak floor emerged beneath it. Unmarked. Solid. The hand planing gave the surface a texture that caught the afternoon light and gave it depth. The kind of depth that takes years to produce and cannot be replicated by a machine in a factory. She wiped the wall panels with a damp rag. The wood came alive under her hand in a way she hadn't anticipated. The grime was decades of dust and the residue of old air, and as it lifted, the colors of the wood appeared beneath it. Warm honey and amber and streaks of reddish brown, the grain patterns she had seen in the flashlight beam, now revealed in their full depth in the afternoon light. She worked slowly because she could see what she was uncovering, and she did not want to rush it. She cleaned the windows until the daylight came through clean and full. She pulled vines from the east wall by hand, gripping them at the base and pulling steadily until her palms were raw and reddened. The wall beneath the vines was sound. No rot, no damage. The wood had been sealed at some point years ago, and the ceiling had held. By late afternoon, the cabin had transformed. The air inside it had changed. The light inside it had changed. It smelled now less of neglect and more of itself, cedar and old walnut and oak, the particular combination of those woods together in a sealed space. Sylvie stood in the center of the room and turned slowly and tried to understand what she was looking at. It was the same room it had been this morning, and it was entirely different, and the difference was care, attention. The act of someone deciding that this place deserved to be seen. She was on her knees wiping down the base of the fireplace when her rag caught. She stopped. She moved the rag back and forth, slowly feeling for what had stopped it. The stones around the hearth were fitted tight, closed, mortared with careful workmanship. But there was a line running along the edge of one stone at approximately knee height, about 2 feet to the left of center. A straight line, too clean, too deliberate to be a crack that had formed naturally over time. Natural cracks follow the path of least resistance, which is rarely a perfect straight line. This line was straight in the way that a cut is straight. Something made it. She pressed on the stone. Nothing happened. She pressed harder, shifting her weight forward onto her palm. The stone moved. Half an inch inward, then sideways along a path she could feel more than see, traveling smoothly and quietly, and a section of the hearthstone slid open to reveal a space cut into the wall behind the stonework. A cavity the size of a large shoebox. The cold air inside it rose to meet her face. Sylvie held very still. She picked up the flashlight from the floor beside her and angled the beam into the opening. Inside the dark space, wrapped in something dark and stiff, tied with a cord, was a bundle about the size of a thick book. She reached in, her fingers closed around it, lighter than she expected for its size. She lifted it out carefully and set it on the floor in front of her. The wrapping was oilcloth, old but not brittle, still flexible, still doing its job after however many years it had been sitting in that cavity. She untied the leather cord and unrolled the oilcloth with the slow care of someone who doesn't know what they're holding, but understands it is something. Inside was a carved wooden figure, maybe 8 inches tall. A hawk, wings half spread, head turned slightly to one side, the beak just parted. Every feather had been cut individually into the wood with a blade so fine and controlled that the lines between the feathers were thinner than a fingernail. The grain of the wood ran through the spread wings in a pattern that made the feathers appear to have weight and movement, as if the bird had been caught between one wing beat and the next. The talons gripped a branch. The branch had texture. The bark of the branch had been carved to suggest the rough, layered quality of real bark. Sylvie held it up to the flashlight. She turned it slowly in her hands, looking at it from every angle. She had never held anything carved from wood before, not like this. She had held mass-produced things and handmade things and things that cost money and things that cost nothing. But she had never held something where the skill of the person who made it was this visible, this fully present in the object itself. You could feel the intelligence in it, the patience, the long hours in a room alone with a block of wood and a set of blades and a vision of what the wood could become. She turned it over. On the base carved small and clean 2 letters in a year. E.H. 1974. Edmund Harmon. Whoever he was, whatever the Harmon family thought of him or didn't think of him, whatever had happened between him and his sons, this man had spent decades on a mountain, and he had been doing something in that time that no one who had written him off had bothered to look for. She wrapped the hawk carefully in its oilcloth and set it on the table. Then she went back to the fireplace and ran her hands along the surrounding stones, pressed each one methodically. Most were solid built, tight, going nowhere. 2 feet to the left of the first compartment, her palm found another straight seam. She pressed, and a second section slid open. 2 more figures inside each wrapped in their own square of oilcloth, each tied with their own leather cord. A fox sitting upright. Ears forward alert, the tail curved around the front feet, with the end tip raised slightly. The expression on the fox's face, if you could call it an expression, was the particular watchful intelligence of a real fox that has seen you before you've seen it. A deer, head lowered toward a stream carved along the base, the water represented by a pattern of overlapping arcs that somehow communicated movement the way the best carving communicates things the wood alone shouldn't be able to say. Both signed, E.H. the fox dated 1971, the deer 1978. 3 carvings, hidden in a fireplace in a cabin that the county had appraised at $3. Sylvie sat on the floor with the 3 figures lined up in front of her, the flashlight propped against the base of the fireplace, throwing its beam across them. She looked at the hawk. She looked at the fox. She looked at the deer. Then she looked at the walls. If he had hidden 3 pieces behind the fireplace, what else had he hidden? She sat with that question in the quiet of the cabin, while the evening came down outside the clean windows, and the light in the room shifted from gold to blue to the particular gray dark of a mountain night. The hawk was on the table where she had set it. The fox and the deer were beside it. The flashlight beam fell across all 3 of them. She thought about Lorraine sliding the key across a conference table with 1 finger. She thought about the weight of the key in her hand. She thought about the door with the carving that had made her stop and run her fingers across it before she'd even unlocked the lock. She unrolled her sleeping bag on the bed slats and lay down and looked up at the ceiling in the dark. The ceiling was paneled too. She had noticed that during the day. The same careful wood, the same matched grain. She thought about what was behind the panels. She thought about what a man does with 30 years on a mountain alone, a man who could carve a hawk so real you could count the feathers. She thought about where else in these walls he might have put the things he made. The wind moved through the trees on the ridge and pressed against the cabin walls. The walls did not move. She did not sleep much that second night. She lay on the bed slats with the sleeping bag pulled up to her shoulders and looked at the ceiling and thought about what was behind the walls. The 3 figures were on the table where she had left them, wrapped back in their oilcloth, and she could not stop thinking about the logic of them. A man hides 3 pieces behind a fireplace, not on a shelf, not in a box under a bed. Behind a fireplace, behind stones fitted so tightly and so precisely that a person could run their hands along that hearth 100 times without finding the seams unless they knew to look for them. That was not the behavior of a man who made things casually. That was not the behavior of a man who expected anyone to find them anytime soon. That was the behavior of a man who was building for a specific kind of discovery patient and deliberate, who understood that the right person in the right moment might be separated by decades and was willing to wait. She thought about what that meant, about what kind of person plans that way. She thought about the walls. She was awake when the light started coming through the windows, that earliest gray, before the sun actually rises, the light that arrives before its source. She got up, folded the sleeping bag, put on her shoes, and stood in the center of the room in the growing light, and looked at the paneled walls with different eyes than she'd had the day before. 47 panels, roughly by her count, some larger, some smaller, fitted together in a pattern that was not strictly uniform, which she had assumed was an aesthetic choice. Now she was not sure it was only that. Now she was wondering whether the variation in panel size served a different purpose, whether some of those panels were not walls at all. She drove down the mountain before 8 and used the payphone outside the gas station to call the number Vera Caldwell had given her 2 days earlier, when Sylvie had stopped on the road and Vera had walked over from her garden and introduced herself and made coffee and asked the kind of direct questions that some people find intrusive and Sylvie had found like clean water after a long dry stretch. Vera answered on the second ring. "I found something in the fireplace," Sylvie said. "Behind the stones, 3 carvings wrapped in oilcloth, signed and dated." There was a pause. "How are they?" Vera said. "They're extraordinary," Sylvie said. "I don't have better words than that. I've never seen anything like them." Another pause longer. "You need to call Ray Briggs," Vera said. "I'll give you his number." Ray Briggs arrived at the cabin 2 days later on a Thursday morning. He drove a truck that had more miles on it than Sylvie's car and her apartment combined, and the bed of the truck was fitted with a custom rack for lumber and tools that he had clearly built himself. He parked in the clearing and sat in the truck for a moment looking at the cabin through the windshield before he got out. Then he got out slowly, the way a person does when they want to take something in properly before they start moving through it. He was in his mid-50s, broad across the shoulders, with hands that told you everything about what a person had done with their life. Thick through the palm, the knuckles slightly enlarged the skin of the fingers marked with the small scars that accumulate over decades of working with sharp tools in close quarters. He walked to the porch without speaking and crouched at the corner post, running his hand along the joint where the post met the porch frame. He straightened up, walked to the front door. He stood there looking at the carvings on the door the way Sylvie had stood there the first night, but where Sylvie had run her fingers across the surface because it was beautiful and because her hand moved before she thought about it. Ray Briggs traced the carvings with a specific attention. He was reading them, looking at the depth of each cut, the angle of approach, the way the tool had entered the wood, and the way it had left. Looking at the craft beneath the image. "Let me see inside," he said. Sylvie opened the door and stepped back and let him enter. He walked in and his forward motion simply stopped the way a person stops when the room they have walked into requires them to recalibrate something fundamental before they can continue. His eyes moved from the wall panels to the fireplace mantel, to the bed frame, to the shelf brackets shaped like open hands. He did not say anything. He breathed slowly and looked, and his expression was the expression of a man in the presence of something that has recalibrated something inside him, something he thought was already calibrated correctly. Then he walked to the nearest wall panel and bent close. He looked at the seam where 2 boards met. He was close enough that his nose was nearly touching the wood. "Dovetail," he said quietly to himself as much as to her. "Cut by hand. No jig." He moved to the fireplace mantel. He ran his palm along the carved surface, not hurrying, feeling the relief of the carving under his hand, the depth of it, the way the tool marks were resolved in each cut to a clean finish. He crouched and looked at the joint where the wood surround met the stone of the fireplace, the precise point where 2 different materials met and were expected to coexist for decades without either one failing. Then he stood up and looked at her. "Who did this?" he said. He already knew. Vera had told him on the phone. But he asked anyway, and Sylvie understood that he was asking not because he needed the information, but because he needed to say the name in this room. "Edmund Harmon," she said. Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he walked to the bed frame and gripped one of the corner posts in both hands and tried to move it. Not gently. He applied real force, the kind of force you apply when you are testing something and want an honest result. The post did not budge, it did not creak, it did not flex or shift or give in any direction. It was as fixed as if it had grown there. "I've been doing this 30 years, Ray said. He was still looking at the post. "I couldn't do this. Not any of it. The joinery on those wall panels alone, the way the grain is matched board to board." He turned and looked at the room again slowly, the full sweep of it. "This is museum work." He looked at the fireplace. "I saw a piece by Edmund Harmon at an auction house in Asheville about 4 years ago," he said. "A rocking chair, cherry wood hand-joined. Simple lines, no ornamentation. Just the joinery and the proportions and the grain selection." He paused. "It sold for $62,000. The number landed in the room and sat there. Sylvie did not move. "62,000, Ray said again, for a rocking chair with no carvings. And that's smaller work than what I'm looking at right here." He gestured at the mantel without taking his eyes from it. "That mantel alone." "Show him," Sylvie said. She knelt at the fireplace and pressed the first stone. The panel slid open with the same smooth motion it had made the first time, the stone moving inward and then sideways along its hidden track, quiet and precise. She reached in and brought out the hawk and unwrapped it. Ray took it from her with both hands. He held it level, rotating it slowly, bringing it closer to the window where the morning light was strongest. He held it up so the light came through the spread wings and illuminated the grain running through the feathers. He did not speak for a long time. "Show me the others," he said. She opened the second compartment. The fox and the deer came out. Ray examined each one with the same slow attention, turning them in the light, looking at the signatures on the bases, looking at the dates. Then he looked at the walls. If he hid 3 pieces behind the fireplace, he said slowly, "There's more in these walls." They spent the next 2 hours searching. Once Sylvie showed Ray what the seams looked like once she pressed the first stone again, so he could watch the mechanism operate and understand the logic of it. He found the hidden panels faster than she could. His hands knew wood with an intimacy that came from 30 years of working with it daily, and he could feel the difference between a structural joint that was fixed and a joint that was designed to move. He pressed along the wall panels with his palms, methodically section by section, and when a panel moved under his hand even fractionally, he stopped and worked it until he found the seam. The first wall compartment was behind the panel nearest the window, low on the north wall. It was larger than the fireplace cavities cut into the space between the inner wall and the outer structure, deep enough to hold significant objects. Inside, wrapped individually in oilcloth, were 7 pieces of a child's rocking chair. Each piece was wrapped separately because each piece was a finished object in its own right, the joints pre-cut and fitted, the surfaces carved and smoothed. A small wooden plaque was tucked in among the pieces, carved with a message, in the same precise hand, assemble with care. No glue needed. E.H. 1969. They unwrapped each piece on the porch floor and fitted them together without tools, following the logic of the joints, the way each tenon found its mortise exactly. When the last piece locked into place, the chair was solid and balanced and proportioned for a child of about 6, and the carving on the headboard was a pattern of apple blossoms that ran from one post across the top rail to the other without interruption. Ray sat back on his heels and looked at it. 1969, he said. He's been building these compartments since at least 69. The second compartment was in the east wall waist height, behind a panel that had seemed no different from the ones beside it. The folding writing desk came out in 3 sections that interlocked when deployed. The surface was inlaid with 2 different woods, dark walnut and pale maple, forming an interlocking border of leaves that ran around the entire perimeter of the writing surface. The inlay work required that each piece of maple and each piece of walnut be cut to fit exactly within the border, the joints between them thin as a line drawn with a pen. There were more than 60 individual pieces in the inlay. Each one had been cut separately and fitted separately, and the result was a surface that looked like it had been woven. The third compartment gave them 3 more animal figures. A bear standing upright, one paw slightly raised, the fur suggested by thousands of tiny parallel cuts that caught the light and created the illusion of depth. A pair of rabbits, one sitting and one lying down, positioned as if they had arrived at this spot together and made different decisions about how to spend the afternoon. A trout leaping from carved water. The water, a series of overlapping curves that conveyed movement, the way the deer's stream had conveyed movement through the suggestion of form rather than its literal reproduction. The trout was the latest piece. 1998. He was still making them in 1998, Ray said, turning the trout in his hands. He was still here in 1998, Sylvie said. Ray set the trout down carefully. The fourth compartment was behind the panel nearest the bed, close to the floor, and it held something neither of them had expected. Not a finished piece. Tools. Edmund Harmon's own tools laid in a fitted rack of hand-bent copper wire mounted to a cedar backing board, a set of chisels in graduated sizes, 3 gouges, a small block plane, 2 knives with handles turned from wood that had darkened and smoothed from decades of use. Each tool was sharp. She could see that from the way the light caught the edges, the angle of the bevel, the absence of any oxidation on the steel. He had sharpened them last, whatever last meant, whenever the last time was that he had set them down here. Was carved into the copper rack above each tool's position. He hid his tools with the work, Ray said. He looked at the tools in the rack for a long moment, like he wanted whoever found this to understand the connection, that the thing and the making of the thing weren't separate. They brought everything to the porch and laid it out. The hawk, the fox, the deer, the rocking chair assembled and standing, the writing desk deployed and open to the light, the bear, the rabbits, the trout, and the tools in their rack. 10 pieces plus the cabin itself, plus the mantel, plus the bed frame, plus the wall paneling, plus the door. Ray sat down on the top porch step. He took off his cap and rubbed his forehead. He held the cap in his hands for a moment. 10 pieces, he said, plus the built-in work. Sylvie. He looked at her. He looked back through the open door at the mantel and the walls and the matching grain of all that careful paneling. This isn't a cabin. She waited. This is a gallery, he said. They sat with that for a while. The afternoon was warm, the clearing full of the particular golden light that comes when the sun is high enough to reach the floor of a mountain valley, but already beginning its lean toward the west. A hawk was up above the tree line, the same thermal the birds used every day, working the same invisible column of rising air. You need an appraiser, Ray said. A real one, not the county. Someone who knows fine woodcraft and understands what Edmund Harmon's name means in the market. I don't have money for an appraiser, Sylvie said. I'll front it, Ray said. You can pay me back when you're ready. He looked at the trout in his hand, turned it once more, set it down. This is too important to let sit. That evening, after Ray had driven down the mountain with a name written on a piece of paper that he pressed into her hand before he left, Sylvie sat on the porch floor with the 10 pieces arranged around her in the last of the daylight and thought about the man who had made them. She thought about what it meant to spend decades alone on a mountain making things of this quality and hiding them, not selling them, not showing them, hiding them. She thought about the walls and whether she had found everything. Then she remembered the panel behind the table. She had moved the table that morning to sweep under it, and she had noticed a line near the floor low on the wall behind where the table usually sat, and she had meant to come back to it. And then Ray had arrived, and the day had gone in the direction the day went. She went inside and moved the table again. The line was there. Same character as the others, straight, deliberate, too clean for a natural crack or a settling seam. She pressed along the panel and found the edge that moved. The panel swung inward on hidden hinges, smooth and quiet, revealing a shallow space lined in cedar. The smell that came out of it was sharp and immediate, the real smell of freshly exposed cedar, as if the panel had been sealed against the air for years, and the air inside it had not moved since. Inside the cedar-lined space was a drawer built directly into the wall structure itself. Cherrywood face, hand-fitted, polished to a deep, warm glow. No handle. No visible latch or hardware of any kind, just a flat face of wood set into the cedar surround. She tried pulling it by pressing her fingers against the face and drawing it toward her. Nothing. She tried pressing the top, the sides, the bottom. Nothing. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. Everything else had opened with pressure. Every other compartment had revealed itself when she pushed. This one wasn't opening, which meant it was different, which meant he had decided this one required something more than the patience to find it. She ran her thumb along the bottom edge of the drawer face slowly, the way you read something in the dark by touch when you can't see the words. Her thumb stopped. Not a latch. Letters. Small, shallow, carved into the underside of the drawer face, where they would be invisible to anyone standing or sitting or even kneeling at normal height. You would only find them by lying flat on the floor and feeling along the bottom edge with your fingers, or by pressing your face close to the floor and angling a light beam upward to catch the shadows in the cuts. She brought the flashlight down and held it at floor level, angled up toward the underside of the drawer face. 6 words carved in Edmund Harmon's precise and careful hand, for the one they give it to. She read them twice. Then she read them a third time, lying on the floor of a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, with a flashlight in her hand and the smell of cedar around her. For the one they give it to. He had written those words for whoever would be lying on this floor. Not for a specific person, for a circumstance. He had known the circumstance as clearly as if he had watched it happen. His family would give this cabin away. They would give it to someone they considered unimportant, someone whose claim they did not take seriously, someone they handed the smallest possible thing and called it a gift. He had known that person would come. He had prepared for that person with the same exactness he brought to every joint and every carving. He had prepared a locked drawer that would open only for someone who had been given what he had been given. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the key. The HC7 key. The one with the faded paper tag, the one Lorraine had slid across the conference table with one finger. She had been carrying it since that day, not in her purse in her pocket. She did not know why she had made that particular choice, except that pockets are where you put things you need access to quickly, things you might need without warning, and she had sensed, without being able to articulate it, that this key was that kind of thing. She looked at the key and then at the keyhole. The shaft of the key was too thick for the lock she could see in the edge of the drawer face. She could see that at a glance. But she turned the key over in her hand and looked at the tip, the end of the shaft, and she saw that it tapered. The main shaft was standard cabinet key gauge, but the last half-inch narrowed to a smaller diameter, a thinner gauge that she had not noticed before because she had not been looking for it. She brought the narrow tip to the keyhole. It fit. She turned it. There was a soft, clean click like the sound of something deciding to open. The drawer released. She pulled it out along its track, which ran smooth and true, the wood of the drawer gliding in the wood of the surround, with the fit of 2 pieces made for each other, which they were. The drawer was shallow, perhaps 3 inches deep, but it ran the full width of the wall panel, which made it wide. Inside, the cedar lining continued, and resting in the cedar were 4 journals. Dark brown covers, leather worn at the spines from handling each one, held closed with a leather strap buckled at the side. They were stacked neatly arranged by size, the largest on the bottom, and they had been placed here with the care that Edmund Harmon brought to everything he placed anywhere. Beside the journals, a single envelope, not sealed, nothing written on the outside. She lifted the first journal and carried it to the table and set it down. The evening light was still enough to read by coming through the windows. She had cleaned 2 days ago, the clean glass letting in everything the dirty glass had kept out. She sat down. She opened the cover. Edmund Harmon's handwriting was small and precise. The letters formed with the same economy and control he brought to every mark he made. The first entry was dated March 14th, 1962. Started the foundation today. Dug the footings by hand. 4 corners 16 inches deep. The ground up here is rocky, but it drains well. Nobody around but the hawks. That suits me fine. She turned pages. The entries were not daily, sometimes a week between them, sometimes more. He wrote about the work the way a man writes when writing is not his primary language, but is useful for keeping track, direct, specific, without ornamentation. The first wall frame went up in 11 days. White oak from the south slope, he noted the grain on those boards better than anything he'd worked with before. He wrote about weather. He wrote about what he ate. He wrote occasionally about the hawks. She skipped forward. The entries from the late 1960s and through the 1970s had a different quality. The cabin was built by then, and he was working on the interior, the things he would spend years on. There was an entry about the mantle that ran for 2 pages more than anything else in those first journals, the most words he had given to any single piece. November 22nd, 1973. Finished the mantle today. Took 4 months. Walnut from the tree that came down in the October storm, the big one at the south edge of the clearing that I'd been watching for 15 years. I carved the whole ridge into it. The flowers Martha used to pick along the creek in June. The birds that nest in the eaves every spring. The vine that comes up the east wall. I put all of it in there because all of it belongs here and nowhere else. She would have liked it. She would have told me it was too much. She was always right about that. Sylvie stopped. She reread the last 3 sentences. She sat with them for a moment. She turned more pages. The entries from the 1980s were different in another way. There were fewer of them, and they were shorter, and they had a careful quality, a deliberateness in the word choice, as if he was writing around something he could not say directly, as if the journal was being written with the awareness that it might be read, and he was deciding sentence by sentence how much of what he knew to put on paper. June 3rd, 1984. The boys came up last month, first time in 3 years. They wanted me to sign some papers. I signed them. I don't think I should have. December 18th, 1986. Got a letter from a lawyer in Charlotte. The property down in the valley has been restructured into a family trust. My name is on none of it. I built that house with my hands, cleared that land with a mule and a cross-cut saw. I poured every concrete block in that foundation myself. Now it belongs to a trust I didn't create and cannot access. They did it legally. I checked. She stopped again. She sat still for a moment with the journal open in front of her, looking at those 2 entries, the gap between them, the silence that 2.5 years of not writing represented. She thought about what a man does between June of 1984 and December of 1986. What he decides, what he accepts, what he files somewhere deep and keeps working because the work is what he has and the work is what cannot be taken by a signature on a form he should not have signed. She kept reading. The entries from the 1990s were where the purpose of the hidden compartments became clear. He had started building them in 1969 with the rocking chair, though at that point he had been thinking of it differently. He wrote about it in 1991, the year he built the first fireplace cavity. February 7th, 1991. Built the first compartment behind the hearth today. Took a week to get the stone hinge right, to get it smooth enough that the action would still work 30 years from now. Put the hawk inside. First piece I ever made that I thought was good enough to keep. I've been thinking for a while now about what this place is. What it's for. Not the living, I mean. The other thing. She turned pages. March 30th, 1994. 4 compartments now. The wall panels are the hardest because the wood has to match exactly on both sides of the hinge. If the grain doesn't continue across the seam is visible to anyone looking. I've been at this one panel for 3 weeks. Nobody looking at these walls would know they open. That's the point. She paused at that last sentence. Read it again. That's the point. She thought about Lorraine, who had never been here. She thought about Garrett, who had laughed at the appraised value and called it great-granddad's old shack. She thought about the lawyer in the conference room, carefully not looking at either of them. She thought about the key sliding across the polished wood. She kept reading. The final journal covered the last decade of Edmund Harmon's time on the mountain. His handwriting had changed. The letters were larger, pressed harder into the pages, the mark of hands that had developed the slight tremor of age compensating for it by bearing down. But the entries were sharper, more direct, as if the physical difficulty of writing had cleared away whatever reluctance had made the earlier entries careful. August 11, 2003. I know what this cabin is now. It took me 40 years to understand it. I thought I was building a home. I was building an inheritance. Not for my sons, they took their inheritance already. They took the valley land and the house I built, And the 30 years I spent making something there, and they turned it into shopping centers, and they slept fine. This is different. This is for the one who comes after. The one they'll give this place to because they think it's worthless. Because they think everything I ever touched is worthless. They won't come up here themselves. They'll hand this key to the person they want to disappear, and they won't look back. I know my sons. I know how this family works. September 29th, 2005. Finish the cedar drawer today. This is where the journals go. The drawer has a lock that matches the cabin key. Whoever gets the cabin gets the key. Whoever gets the key gets the drawer. I carved 6 words on the face where you can only find them by touch. I hope whoever finds them understands. January 14th, 2008. I'm 78. My hands are slower, but they still work. The trout was the last animal I could carve. The fingers aren't precise enough anymore for that scale of work. 14 finished pieces behind these walls. If anyone finds them who knows what they're looking at, this cabin is worth more than everything my sons built with my land. I like that thought. Martha would have called it petty. She was probably right. But she also would have understood. She understood most things. Sylvie set the journal down. She pressed her hands flat on the table Edmund Harmon had built and placed beneath this window, and she breathed. The evening had gone fully to dark while she read, and the cabin was lit only by the oil lamp Ray had brought her. And in the lamplight, the carved mantel on the far wall threw its small shadows, the flowers and birds and vine alive in the moving flame. She picked up the envelope. Not sealed, nothing written on the front. Inside, a single sheet of paper folded once. The handwriting larger than in the journals, more deliberate, the letters of a man who understood that this was the version that mattered most. She stood up and carried it to the window. The night outside was full dark now. She held the lamp close and read, "To whoever is reading this, if you found these journals, you found the drawer. If you found the drawer, you have the key. If you have the key, my family gave you this cabin because they thought it was nothing. They are wrong. I built this place over 30 years. Every panel, every joint, every piece behind these walls. I hid my best work here because I knew my sons would never come looking. They took my land. They took the house I built and the acres I cleared and every dollar I earned before they were old enough to hire their own lawyers. They did it legally and they slept fine afterward. I am not surprised. I knew what I had raised by the time I understood what they'd done. The surprise was mine alone. I could have sold these pieces. I could have sold each one the year I finished it and bought myself something for the money. Each one is worth more than this family ever compensated me for my land. But I did not sell them. I hid them. I wanted them to be found by the person my family would throw away. The way they threw me away. You are that person. I am sorry for what they did to you. I don't know what it was. I know only the shape of it because I know how this family operates, how it has always operated, and the shape never changes. Someone decided you were not worth keeping. Someone handed you this key like it was an insult and walked away satisfied. But I am glad you are here. Take what is behind these walls. It is yours. All of it. The cabin, the carvings, the furniture, the tools. I made them for you. I made them for someone who would need them. I hope you are that person. Edmund Harmon, February 2009. Sylvie folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. She stood at the window in the lamplight for a long time. Outside, the mountain was completely dark and completely still. The hawks were roosting somewhere on the ridge. The clearing was empty. The road down the mountain was invisible in the trees. She was alone on a mountain with a lamp and a letter written to her by a man who had been dead for 13 years and had still managed to be more present in this cabin than any living member of his family had ever been. She gathered the journals and the letter, carefully wrapped them in a clean cloth from her bag, and set them on the table beside the 3 carved figures. She sat down. She thought about what the letter meant. Not in terms of the legal questions, not yet, not the practical implications of 14 hidden pieces of work by an artist whose name meant something in the market. She thought about what it meant that a man had spent decades building something for an unknown person, Someone he could not have named or described, someone he knew only by the pattern of how his family treated the people it decided were disposable. He had extrapolated from his own experience. He had looked at what his sons had done to him and understood that they would do it again to someone eventually, and he had built something for that person. She thought about Vera 2 miles down the road, who had brought Edmund bread and coffee once a month for decades because it was the right thing to do and no one else was doing it, who had called someone after he stopped answering the door, who had looked at Sylvie on a dirt road 4 days ago and recognized something in her posture and her eyes and had walked over and pulled off one glove and introduced herself. She drove down the mountain to Vera's house. The kitchen was warm and lit when she got there, the yellow curtains bright against the dark outside. Vera was at the table with a cup of tea and a book, and she looked up when Sylvie knocked and came in, and she took one look at Sylvie's face and stood up. "What did you find?" she said. Sylvie set the journals on the table and set the envelope beside them. Vera read the letter standing at the table the way Sylvie had read it at the window. She read it once, then read it again, her lips moving slightly on the second pass. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. "That man," she said. "That stubborn, beautiful man." They sat down. Vera poured Sylvie a cup of tea and did not ask if she wanted one. Sylvie spread the journals on the table and showed her the key entries. Vera read them slowly. Her finger traced the handwriting. "He told me once that the cabin wasn't finished," Vera said. She was looking at the entry about the compartments. "I assumed he meant the porch or the roof or some other structural thing he was getting to eventually." She looked up. "He meant the hiding places. He was still building them when I was bringing him groceries." Sylvie told her about the 1986 entry, the letter from the Charlotte lawyer, the restructured trust. Vera was quiet for a moment. "I knew pieces of it," she said. "Ed didn't talk about it directly. But when his son stopped coming up, when the certified letters started arriving from out of state, when he stopped going to town at all, I put it together well enough." She set the journal down gently. "He never complained about it, not once in all the years I knew him. He would mention his sons occasionally, very occasionally, and his voice wouldn't change when he did it. That was the tell. People who are angry sound angry even when they're trying not to. Ed just sounded like he'd decided. Decided what Sylvie said." Vera looked at her. "That some things you fight and some things you carry and some things you build something better than." Sylvie looked at the letter in its envelope. "He wrote this for me," she said. "He wrote it for whoever they gave the cabin to. That turned out to be me. That turned out to be you." Vera agreed. Sylvie was quiet for a moment. "Colt knew about this place," she said. "He loved it. He told me about it once, the hawks over the ridge, the most peaceful place he'd ever been. He never told me what was inside it. He never told me his grandfather was capable of this." Vera looked at her carefully. "Colt came up every summer when he was young," she said. "His father didn't know. His mother would have put a stop to it if she had. Colt figured out the bus route from Raleigh when he was about 11. He'd come into town and walk the rest of the way. He and Ed would sit on that porch for hours. I'd see them sometimes when I brought supplies up." Sylvie stared at the table. "He never told me any of that." "He might not have known what to do with it," Vera said. "He grew up in a family that didn't talk about Ed. When his father found out about the visits and stopped them, Colt was 16, old enough to understand what was being taken from him and not old enough to fight it." She paused. "By the time he met you, Ed had been up on that mountain alone for a long time. Colt probably didn't know how to explain it. Didn't know how to explain what Ed was without explaining everything else the family had done. And that's a long conversation that starts in painful places." Sylvie thought about that. Before she left, Vera walked her to the door and said one more thing. Colt carved something into the porch railing. Bottom rail left side near where the corner post meets it. He did it the summer before his father found out. Sylvie drove back up the mountain in the dark. She parked in the clearing and walked to the porch with the flashlight. She crouched at the left side of the railing where the bottom rail ran close to the porch floor. She angled the flashlight beam at the underside of the rail. The marks were small. A boy's knife work, the letters slightly uneven, cut into the underside of the wood where no one standing or walking on the porch would see them. Two letters, C and E, Colt, Edmund. The two of them. A 16-year-old boy who had figured out a bus route at 11 years old because there was something on a mountain he needed, and an old man who received him without fanfare and sat with him on a porch for hours without needing to say much. Both of them hiding the things that mattered in a family that had decided not to look. Sylvie sat on the porch floor with her back against the railing just above those two letters. The mountain was dark and quiet in every direction. The lamp inside the cabin threw its warm light through the clean windows into the dark clearing. The journals were on the table. The hawk was on the table. The letter was on the table. She thought about Edmund Harmon digging footings alone in March of 1962 with nobody around but the hawks. She thought about Colt at 11 years old getting on a bus because he had understood something about his grandfather that no one in his family wanted him to understand. She thought about herself 8 months ago, standing in a room above a dentist's office, listening to the inventory of a life being distributed among the people who had done nothing to build it. 3 people, 3 generations. The same family had made the same decision about all 3 of them, had looked at them and decided they were not worth keeping, had handed them what it considered worthless and walked away satisfied. But Edmund Harmon had not let the decision be the end of the story. He had spent 30 years making sure it wasn't. She went inside. She picked up the paper with the appraiser's number written on it in Ray's handwriting, taped to the inside of the front door. She couldn't call tonight. No signal up here. Tomorrow she would drive to Vera's and use the landline. She lay down in the dark and pulled the sleeping bag up. The cedar smell from the open drawer was still in the air, mixing with the old wood smell of the walls, the walnut and oak, and the smell of the lamp. Outside, the wind came along the ridge and pressed against the cabin. The walls did not move. She called Leonard Voss from Vera's landline the next morning. Vera stood at the kitchen counter making coffee while Sylvie dialed the number Ray had written down, and neither of them spoke while the phone rang 3 times and then connected. Sylvie told the man who answered what she had. She kept it brief. 1-room cabin in Henderson County, Blue Ridge, built by Edmund Harmon between 1962 and approximately 1990. 14 carved pieces found in hidden compartments behind the walls. Built-in furniture and architectural woodwork throughout. 4 journals in the maker's hand documenting the work across 4 decades. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "How many pieces did you say?" Leonard Voss said. 14, Sylvie said, plus the cabin itself. Another pause longer than the first. "I can be there Thursday," he said. He arrived on a Thursday morning 3 days later, driving a clean sedan up the dirt road and parking carefully at the edge of the clearing as if he did not want to disturb the ground. He was tall in his early 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and the unhurried movements of a man who had learned long ago that the quality of his attention was worth more than the speed of his conclusions. He carried a leather case with the worn patina of professional equipment used regularly for many years. He shook Sylvie's hand at the edge of the clearing and then stood looking at the cabin for a full minute before he moved toward it. Ray had come up that morning as well, arriving before Voss, parking his truck beside Sylvie's car and carrying a thermos of coffee and a tool bag, because there were always things that needed doing, and Ray Briggs was not the kind of man who stood around empty-handed. "Ray Briggs called me 3 days ago," Voss said. "He told me what you found. I've handled 3 Edmund Harmon pieces in the past decade. I had reason to believe there were more somewhere. I didn't imagine there would be this many in one location." "How many have you handled?" Sylvie asked. 3. A small side table, a wall clock, and a mirror frame. All cherry wood, all hand-joined, all authenticated through provenance. The mirror frame went at auction 18 months ago. Sylvie had already looked up that auction, had found the listing on her phone during a trip down the mountain, and the number she had found there had sat in her mind like something she was still getting used to the weight of. Voss confirmed it now. $71,000, he said, for a mirror frame. And that piece had uncertain provenance. There was a dispute about origin documentation. He looked at the cabin. "These won't have that problem," he said. "You have 4 journals." He went inside. Voss crossed the threshold and his forward motion stopped entirely. It was not hesitation. It was something more complete than that, a full arrest of movement, while his eyes assembled the room the way a careful reader moves through a difficult passage, slowly taking nothing for granted, understanding that what is in front of him deserves that kind of attention. His gaze moved from the wall panels to the mantel, to the bed frame, to the shelf brackets shaped like open hands, and he stood there without speaking for nearly a minute. Then he set his case on the table and put on cotton gloves. He started with the cabin itself. He worked methodically panel by panel, starting at the door and moving clockwise around the room. He pressed his gloved fingertips along the seams of each wall panel, bending close to examine the grain matching, moving a small magnifying loop from his case to look at the surface of the wood where the finish met the edge of each board. He measured the fireplace mantel from 3 angles with a small folding rule, photographed the relief depth of the carving at 6 points along its length, and made notes in a leather-covered notebook with a mechanical pencil. He spent nearly 20 minutes on the bed frame alone. He examined every joint, every spindle, the full run of the mountain laurel carving on the headboard. He looked at the mortise and tenon where the corner post met the side rail, and then looked at it again through the loop, not moving for several minutes. The headboard, he said, he was still looking through the loop, is a museum piece on its own. The relief depth is consistent to within a millimeter across the entire surface. That's freehand work, no template, no guide marks. He carved it directly into the wood. He moved to the door carvings, examined them from both sides, inside and out, and photographed them from 6 angles. He looked at the shelf brackets shaped like open hands, the curve of the fingers, the point where the carving transitioned from bracket to wall. Then Sylvie showed him the compartments. She pressed the first fireplace stone and the panel slid open, and Voss watched the mechanism operate with an expression that did not change, but whose stillness was itself a kind of response. She brought out the hawk. He took it from her with both gloved hands and held it at arm's length in the window light, rotating it slowly. Then he brought it closer and looked at it through the loop moving across the surface, methodically the way a doctor examines something when the examination itself is the diagnosis. His face went completely still. Not the stillness of someone concealing a reaction. The stillness of someone in whom the reaction was too large for expression and had simply stopped the ordinary movements that fill a face. This is his early period, Voss said. The featherwork. I've seen photographs of a similar hawk in a private collection in Virginia. The collector acquired it 6 years ago. Sylvie, that hawk sold for $90,000, and the provenance on that piece was disputed. There were questions about whether it was genuinely Harmon's hand. He turned the hawk over and looked at the base. This one is signed, he said. E.H. 1974, Sylvie said. Signed and dated. He set the hawk down with great care. That is authenticated provenance. Show me the rest. She opened every compartment. Ray helped carry the rocking chair pieces and the writing desk out to the porch, where the morning light was full and even. Voss laid each piece on a clean cloth he spread on the porch boards and worked through them one by one, examining each signature, each date, each joint, each carved surface. He photographed everything from multiple angles. He measured. He made notes. The morning moved around them, the sun crossing the clearing, the shadow of the tree line moving back as the hours went by. Vera arrived at midday with sandwiches and a thermos. She sat on the porch step and watched Voss work, eating her sandwich slowly, and she did not talk during the examination because she understood what kind of attention was happening and knew better than to interrupt it. By early afternoon, Voss had examined all 14 pieces in the built-in work of the cabin itself. He came inside and sat at the table and opened his notebook. Sylvie sat across from him. Ray stood near the door. Vera stayed on the porch step, but close enough to hear. I need to complete additional comparable sales research before I can give you a formal written appraisal, Voss said. But I can give you a reliable preliminary assessment right now. Go ahead, Sylvie said. He looked at his notes. The 14 standalone pieces, he said. Based on current market comparables for authenticated Harmon works, these fall in a range of $40,000 to $95,000 each. The hawk, the writing desk, and the rocking chair are the most significant of the group. Conservative total for the standalone pieces alone is $840,000. The number sat in the room. Sylvie did not move. The cabin itself is harder to value. Voss continued because there is nothing directly comparable. It is a complete architectural work by a recognized master craftsman. The door, the mantel, the wall, paneling, the bed frame, the built-in shelving, all of it original, all of it hand-joined, all of it signed in some fashion by the maker. A structure like this has never come to market because structures like this don't exist. My preliminary estimate for the cabin as a complete architectural work, exclusive of the land value, is between $600,000 and $800,000. If a museum or a heritage foundation were to acquire it as a preserved site, the number would be considerably higher. Ray spoke from the doorway. Total, he said. Conservative total. Voss closed his notebook. Conservative total for the standalone pieces plus the cabin structure is between $1.6 and $1.8 million. He looked at Sylvie. That number will increase when I complete the comparable analysis. The provenance here is exceptional. Signed dated with 4 journals in the maker's handwriting, documenting the creation of each piece across 40 years. This is the most complete and well-documented collection of Harmon's work ever found in a single location. Sylvie stared at the table. The table Edmund Harmon had built and placed beneath this window so that a person sitting here would have the best light in the room to work by. The Harmon estate, she said, the one that was distributed at the will reading. The house, the car, the savings account. What does that come to roughly? I can't speak to that specifically, Voss said. Roughly, she said. The house was mid-range Raleigh residential. The account was $11,000. The car had 6 payments left on it. Voss was quiet for a moment. Roughly, he said, you're describing a total estate value of somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000, including the car. Sylvie looked at the mantel, at the carved vine that ran its full length, the flowers Edmund had put there because they were the ones his wife used to pick along the creek. She thought about Lorraine's face when she slid the key across the conference table, the patient, sharp expression of a woman performing a gracious act. She almost laughed. It wasn't quite a laugh, more a short sound that carried everything it needed to carry. Edmund, she said quietly to the mantel and to no one else, you stubborn, brilliant man. Voss left his card and promised a formal written appraisal within 2 weeks. He shook her hand at his car and looked back at the cabin one more time before he got in. Don't sell anything until you've spoken to the right institutions, he said. There are museums and foundations that would want to preserve this collection intact. Private buyers will move quickly and offer cash, but they'll scatter the pieces. What's in that cabin is better kept together. The meaning of it depends on the pieces being in the same place. He drove down the mountain. Ray stayed another hour. He had brought lumber in the truck bed, and he spent that hour replacing the 2 worst boards on the porch, the ones Sylvie had marked with chalk in her first week. He worked without being asked, and without discussion, fitting the new boards with the attention of a man who understood that this particular porch deserved to be maintained properly. When he was done, he gathered his tools and stood at the top of the porch steps. This is the most significant day I've had in 30 years of this work, he said. He picked up his tool bag. That's all I wanted to say. He drove down the mountain. Vera walked home in the afternoon and Sylvie was alone. She sat on the floor of the cabin with the 14 pieces arranged around her. In the evening light, the lamp not yet lit, the sun still giving enough. She looked at the hawk and the fox and the deer. She looked at the assembled rocking chair sitting where it would sit from now on beside the fireplace, where Edmund had carved the walnut mantel that had taken him 4 months of a mountain winter. She looked at the writing desk open against the wall, the inlaid surface catching the low light and giving back the pattern of interlocking leaves in dark and pale wood. She picked up Voss's business card and set it down. She thought about what he had said, about institutions, about keeping the pieces together. She already knew what she was going to do. She had known in some form since the moment she had read Edmund's letter standing by the window in the light. She had cleaned the glass to let in. But knowing something and having the number that makes it real are different things. And now she had the number, and what she knew felt solid in a way that knowing alone cannot make it. She was not going to sell. The word moved faster than she expected. By Monday of the following week, two gallery owners had called Vera's landline within the same afternoon. Vera wrote down both numbers on the notepad she kept beside the phone and handed them to Sylvie without comment. Sylvie set them on the table beside the hawk and left them there. On Tuesday evening, Ray drove up with lumber in the truck bed and something else, a small weatherproof camera in a black housing, battery-powered, motion activated. He climbed out of the truck and held it up without preamble. "I'm going to put this on the porch Eve," he said. He did not explain further. He did not need to. The word had moved, and Ray Briggs had been in this valley long enough to know what happened when word moved, and money was involved, and a family like the Harmons was on the other side of the equation. He mounted the camera himself up under the overhang where the eave shadow fell deepest angled to cover the full face of the door in the entire porch width. He tested it with his phone and showed Sylvie the image on the screen, clear wide, time-stamped in the corner in small white numerals. "Lock the door at night," he said. She already did. He drove back down the mountain, and Sylvie stood on the porch in the cooling dark and thought about what it meant that Ray had done that without being asked. That he had simply seen what might come and prepared for it with the same quiet competence he brought to porch boards and cabinet hinges. She went inside and locked the door and listened to the wind move through the trees the way it did every night and tried to sleep. At 2 in the morning on Wednesday, the camera triggered. She was asleep on the bed Edmund had built and did not hear anything. The camera recorded everything in its cold, time-stamped, indifferent way. In the morning, she drove down to Vera's and connected her phone to the Wi-Fi signal and pulled up the footage on the small screen. Garrett's SUV lights off, rolling into the clearing at walking pace. The headlights dark, the engine barely audible on the recording. Garrett getting out alone, moving with the particular careful quiet of someone who believes they are unseen. He stood at the foot of the porch steps for a full 30 seconds, looking at the door and then at the windows, looking at the whole face of the cabin in the dark. Then he moved to the east window, the one farthest from the door, and he worked at the frame with something flat and thin, a pry bar or a painter's tool, working the edge of the window sash with the focused effort of a man who has decided that what's inside a building belongs to him. The window frame held. Edmund had built the frames the same way he had built everything else, with the joinery fitted tight and the wood seasoned hard over 6 decades of mountain air, and they held without complaint. Garrett tried for 4 minutes by the timestamp. Then he stopped. He stood back and looked at the window, and then at the door, and then at the whole dark face of the cabin. Then he got back in the SUV and left. Sylvie sat in Vera's kitchen with the phone in her hand and watched the footage a second time. Then she called the Henderson County Sheriff's Office from Vera's landline. A deputy came up the mountain that afternoon and took her statement, and she forwarded him the footage from her phone. He looked at it twice, made notes, and told her someone would be in touch with Garrett Harmon. He shook her hand at his cruiser and drove back down the mountain road. By noon the next day, Holt Tanner knew about it. She did not know exactly how the information traveled from the sheriff's office to Holt's hardware store, but in a valley this size, information moved the way water moves, finding every crack and low point until it had covered everything. Holt knew, and he mentioned it to 2 men who came in for plumbing fittings that afternoon, and those 2 men mentioned it to others. And by the following morning, Sylvie was up on the porch with her coffee, watching a line of vehicles come up the dirt road one at a time. 7 of them, she counted. They came without being called and without organizing themselves and without any apparent coordination. Holt Tanner with his truck bed loaded with cedar planking. 2 men she had seen once at the diner whose names she didn't know, who introduced themselves as neighbors of Vera's from further down the valley and immediately started examining the east window frame Garrett had worked on. A woman named Patricia from Vera's church who arrived carrying a casserole dish in one hand and a claw hammer in the other and asked where it needed swinging. Ray, who had heard from Holt, who arrived last with his toolbox and his thermos and his particular expression of someone who is not surprised by any of this. Nobody organized it. Nobody assigned tasks or gave directions or waited to be told what to do. They moved through the clearing and around the cabin with the instinct of people who have lived in one place long enough to understand that certain things require showing up, and that showing up is its own complete argument. The 2 men from the valley reinforced the east window frame from the inside, fitting new wood against the old, with careful attention to the original joinery. Holt worked on the remaining window frames, going around the cabin, methodically checking each one, adding reinforcement where needed. Patricia swept the porch a second time and then moved to the south edge of the clearing with a pair of loppers she had brought from her own shed and started on the overgrowth that had been encroaching on the path. Ray found the section of roof flashing he had flagged 3 weeks earlier and climbed up with materials and fixed it. Vera arrived at midday walking with her cane up the last section of the road, breathing hard from the incline. She climbed the porch steps one at a time and settled herself in the rocking chair Edmund had made in 1969 and watched all of it from there, her hands in her lap. Her expression, the expression of someone witnessing something that does not surprise them but still requires witnessing. "This is what Ed would have wanted," she said to Sylvie quietly. "Not the money. This." Sylvie stood at the edge of the porch and looked at all of it. She did not have words for what she was looking at that were not smaller than what it was, so she did not try to find them. She stood there and let it be what it was. The Harmon attorneys called the following Tuesday. Sylvie took the call from Vera's landline because that was where she received calls, standing in Vera's kitchen with the yellow curtains and the check tablecloth and the smell of coffee that seemed to exist in the walls of the house, independently of whether coffee was actually being made. The attorney had a formal voice and a careful vocabulary, and he made 2 points, each one framed as a question requiring clarification, which was the legal equivalent of testing a fence before you commit to climbing it. She told him about the camera Ray had mounted on the porch eave. She described the footage clearly and told him the timestamp and told him who she had forwarded it to at the Henderson County Sheriff's Office. She told him about the journals time-stamped in Edmund's hand across 47 years of consistent entries. She told him that Leonard Voss would be willing to speak to the provenance question, and she gave him Voss's number. The attorney thanked her for her time. She did not hear from the Harmon attorneys again. 2 weeks after that conversation, Voss's formal written appraisal arrived in Vera's mailbox, forwarded from the post office box in Millhaven that Holt Tanner had helped Sylvie set up. She brought it up the mountain and sat at Edmund's table to read it. The formal total was higher than the preliminary estimate, $2.1 million. She read the number twice. The second time it was still the same number. She set the report on the table and looked at the mantel for a while. Then she picked up the report and read Voss's conclusion, which called the collection the most significant single-site documentation of Appalachian mastercraft work recorded in the past 50 years. He noted the exceptional provenance. He noted that the cabin itself, as an intact architectural work by a recognized master, was without comparable precedent in the market. He recommended strongly against disaggregating the collection. 3 museums called over the following 2 weeks. 2 gallery owners. A private collector from Virginia called with a cash offer for the hawk alone, no appraisal required, and the number he named had 7 digits. Then he called back with a higher number. Sylvie turned them all down. Ray drove up on a Saturday morning when she told him bringing his thermos and a bag of hardware that represented the next phase of porch work he had decided needed doing. He sat on the step and listened. "You're not selling any of it," he said. "No," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded once. The small, deliberate nod of a man who had known even while asking what the answer was going to be. "What are you going to do with it?" he said. "Open it," she said. She had been thinking about this for 2 weeks. The right answer had not arrived in a single moment, but had assembled itself gradually, the way understanding assembles when you stop looking for it directly and let it come. She had thought about what Voss had said about keeping the pieces together. She had thought about what Edmund had written, that he had not hidden the pieces to be sold or scattered, but to be found. The finding was the point. The discovery of what was behind the walls by the person who had been handed the key like a dismissal. He had built the whole thing around that moment. The value was not in the individual pieces. The value was in what the whole of it said about what a person can make when the world has decided they have nothing left. She thought it should be seen. 3 days later, on a Thursday morning, she was on the porch with her coffee when she heard an engine coming up the mountain road. Not Ray's truck, not Vera's old station wagon. something heavier with the sound of a vehicle maintained to impress rather than to work. The black SUV came around the final bend alone. Lorraine Harmon got out of the driver's side. She had driven herself 3 hours up a mountain road, and she had come without Garrett. Sylvie noticed at first the single figure stepping out of the vehicle, the absence of the second door opening. Whatever Lorraine had come here to do, she had decided to do it without her son. She stood for a moment beside the car, looking across the clearing at the cabin with the expression of someone seeing something for the first time that they had been in a position to see for decades and had not bothered to. She crossed the clearing and stopped at the foot of the porch steps. Her eyes moved across the new porch boards Ray had fitted, the flat stone path Sylvie had laid, the cleared wildflower meadow that caught the morning light. Then her gaze found the carved front door, and it stopped there. She stood looking at it for a long moment. "Sylvie," she said. Sylvie waited. "We need to talk," Lorraine said. "About what Sylvie said. About what's been reported to us. About what's inside this cabin." Sylvie took a sip of her coffee. "Come inside if you want," she said. They went in. Lorraine's eyes went to the mantel and stayed there. Whatever she had been expecting from 3 hours in a dirt road that offered nothing in the way of comfort, it was not what was in front of her. She stood in the center of the room and looked at it the way people who have spent their lives assessing value look at something they cannot immediately place in any category they already possess. "We've been contacted by an appraiser," Lorraine said. "He indicated that a significant collection of Edmund's work had been located on this property." "That's right," Sylvie said. "These items are Harmon family property," Lorraine said. Her voice was even the tone she used when she had decided how a conversation would go and was simply moving it there. "No," Sylvie said. "They're not. My father-in-law built them. He was a Harmon. He built them in a cabin your family gave to me. They were inside the cabin when I received it. The distribution documents from the attorney don't exclude the contents. You gave me the cabin and everything in it." "Nobody knew what was in here," Lorraine said. "If we had known, the distribution would have been handled differently." "But you didn't know," Sylvie said, "because none of you came up here. Not once in however many years this cabin has existed. Not while Edmund was alive, and not after." "That's beside the point," Lorraine said. "It is exactly the point," Sylvie said. She reached across to the table and picked up the envelope. She had left it there since Voss's visit, the letter inside it, because she had understood that this visit was coming. She held it out to Lorraine. "Read this first." Lorraine took the envelope. She opened it with the efficiency of someone who handles correspondence as a matter of course, unfolded the single sheet, and read. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. The particular quiet of a person encountering something that requires them to decide in real time how to receive it. Lorraine's hand moved once, a small tremor that ran through the paper, barely visible, the kind of thing you would miss if you weren't watching for it. Then her hand was still. She folded the letter. "He was a bitter old man," she said. She said it levelly, without particular force, the way you say something you have prepared. "He was right," Sylvie said, "every word of it." Lorraine's eyes came up from the letter and met hers. "He wrote exactly what happened," Sylvie said. "His sons took his land. His family decided he wasn't worth a trip up a mountain road. And when Colt died, and you had an opportunity to treat me like a person who had lost someone, you handed me a key and called it generosity." She kept her voice level. "I sat in that office and listened to you divide everything Colt had built and put it in accounts with your names on them. You gave me a $3 cabin because it was the smallest thing you could offer without looking cruel to the lawyer in the room." Lorraine looked at the letter in her hand. Then she looked at the mantel. She looked at it for a long time. And then something happened in her face that Sylvie had never seen happen in Lorraine Harmon's face in 3 years of family dinners and holiday gatherings, and the particular social machinery of a family that runs on performance. The composure shifted. Not much. Not in a way that would have been legible from across a room, but Sylvie was close enough and watching, and she saw it. Lorraine saw the mantel, and she saw what it was. Not as a valuable object, not as a praised square footage of carved walnut. She saw the person in it. She saw the man who had spent 4 months of a mountain winter carving the flowers his wife used to pick along a creek, who had lived alone for decades and kept working, who had written in a journal that his wife would have said it was too much, and she was always right. She saw what that kind of devotion looks like when it is the only thing a person has left to give, and they give it anyway. Year after year in a room alone with their tools and the wood and the particular faith that it matters whether or not anyone will ever see it. And in seeing it, she saw the cost of having decided as a family that none of it mattered. She saw the pattern what her husband's family had done to Edmund, what she herself had done to Colt, what she had done in that conference room to the woman standing across from her now. The pattern was not complex. It was simply the repeated choice to treat people as less than they were, made so many times over so many years that it had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like the natural order of things. She had built her understanding of this family on the premise that the natural order was correct, that some people were worth keeping and some people weren't, and the Harmons knew which was which. The mantle told her the cost of that premise. For one moment she held at that knowledge. Then the moment passed. She folded the letter a second time and set it on the table. Her hands were steady. "We'll be in touch," she said. "You won't," Sylvie said. "You'll talk to your attorneys and they'll tell you exactly what I just told you, and then you'll decide whether you want to spend money fighting over something you already signed away in a room you chose in front of a lawyer you hired." She held Lorraine's eyes. "I hope you make the sensible decision." Lorraine walked out of the cabin. The door closed. Her footsteps crossed the porch and descended the steps and moved across the clearing stones. The SUV door closed with the sound of expensive engineering. The engine started. The tires moved carefully over the gravel and found the dirt road, and the sound receded through the trees until the mountain was quiet again. Sylvie stood in the doorway and watched the dust settle over the clearing. Vera appeared around the bend of the road 20 minutes later, walking with her cane, breathing hard from the last section of incline. She had heard the SUV from her place, recognized the sound, and walked up without calling ahead. She climbed the porch steps one at a time and lowered herself into the chair and sat there catching her breath. "She came," Vera said. "She came alone," Sylvie said. She handed Vera the coffee that was still warm. She read the letter. She said Edmund was bitter. Vera looked at her over the rim of the cup, and she said, "Lorraine looked at the mantle," Sylvie said, "and for about 3 seconds, she understood what she'd done, what the whole family had been doing." Vera was quiet for a moment, looking out at the clearing. "3 seconds is more than I expected from that woman," she said finally. The formal written appraisal from Leonard Voss arrived that same week, forwarded from the post office box in Mill Haven. She opened the envelope at Edmund's table in Edmund's light. The number at the bottom of the final page was $2.1 million. She read it twice. Then she set the report on the table and looked at the mantle for a long while without speaking. Then she picked up the telephone number for the first museum that had called and set it down again. She opened the cabin to visitors on the first Saturday of October. It started the way anything in a small town starts, through Holt Tanner, who put a handwritten notice in the window of the hardware store, and through Vera, who mentioned it at her church, and through Ray, who told a contractor he worked with, who told 2 other people. By 9 in the morning, there were 6 cars parked along the dirt road below the clearing, and 11 people standing in the yard looking at the cabin with expressions that reminded Sylvie of the way she had looked at it the first evening she drove up. She gave tours. She showed people the wall panels and the way the grain matched across every seam. She opened the fireplace compartments and let people watch the stone panels slide open on their hidden tracks. She read them short passages from Edmund's journals, not many, just enough to give them the voice of the man who made everything they were looking at. She let them hold the hawk and the fox and the deer, to feel the weight of the wood and the precision of the carving in their own hands. She told them about the key. Every person she told that part to had the same reaction, some version of the same stillness, the same recognition of what it meant that a man had spent 30 years building a hidden inheritance for the specific person his family would throw away. That this was not bitterness, that it was the opposite of bitterness, that bitterness closes and turns inward, and Edmund Harmon had spent 3 decades opening outward. putting his best work behind walls where someone he would never meet would find it and understand. Vera sat in the rocking chair by the fireplace the entire first morning, the chair Edmund had made in 1969 and disassembled and wrapped in oilcloth and hidden behind a wall panel with a note that said, to put it together with care and no glue. She sat in it and rocked slowly and talked to anyone who came close about the man she had known for 30 years, about his hands and his silence, and the way he would sit with you when you needed company and never say anything unnecessary. People listen to Vera the way people listen to someone who has earned the right to speak about a subject through the honest expenditure of time and care. A teacher from the middle school in Millhaven brought her class 3 weeks after the first opening. 14 students sat on the cabin floor and looked at the carved hawk, while Sylvie talked about dovetail joints and oilcloth, and a man who had worked alone on a mountain for decades making things that no one was supposed to see. When she was done, a boy of about 11 raised his hand and asked if she could teach him to carve. 3 more hands went up before she finished nodding. Ray built the workbench on the porch on a Sunday in early November, measuring and cutting and fitting without being asked, working the way he always worked, with the quiet competence of someone who sees what needs doing and does it. He built it from white oak because that was what Edmund had used for the cabin's first wall frame oak from the south slope. The grain on those boards better than anything he'd worked with. When it was done, it sat solid and level against the porch railing, long enough for 3 people to work at comfortably. Sylvie ordered beginner chisel sets from a supplier in Tennessee and laid them out beside Edmund's own tools so that the students could see them side by side, the worn handles and beveled edges of tools that had made 14 museum-quality pieces set next to the clean steel of tools that had not yet made anything but might. She taught from his journals. He had written across those 47 years of entries more about the mechanics of the work than about anything else. He wrote about grain direction and blade angles. He wrote about the patience required to cut a curve correctly, that the mistake is always in hurrying, that the wood knows when you are forcing it and will give you an ugly line. He wrote that the difference between a good joint and a great one is usually a question of whether you stopped before you were done and told yourself it was close enough. She read those passages aloud to her students on Saturday mornings while they worked their chisels, moving slowly and not always accurately against scrap pieces of pine. She was not a master. She was not even competent yet. Her own work was still thick in places and uneven in others, the cuts not fully resolved at their edges. But she kept going because the mantle was above her when she worked inside, and it reminded her without needing to say anything what the wood could eventually become. Holt Tanner repainted the small sign at the bottom of the dirt road in early November. Harmon's Studio, open Saturdays 9 to 2. He did it without discussing it with anyone. Arrived one morning with a board and paint and a post digger and left the sign standing at the road's edge by the time Sylvie drove down for supplies. She stopped and looked at it for a moment. Then she drove on. The Harmon attorneys did not contact her again. Vera's health had been on her mind since September. She noticed the changes with the part of her that had trained as a nurse's aide, the professional attention that reads a person the way you read a room, by what is present and by what is absent. Vera was slower on the hills. She rested between sentences sometimes in a way she hadn't done before. She forgot small things in a way that was different from ordinary forgetting, the kind of forgetting that is not forgetfulness, but something more structural. Sylvie brought groceries down to her twice a week without being asked, and she stayed for coffee and sat with Vera in her kitchen the way Vera had sat with Sylvie in those first weeks on the mountain. "You don't need to take care of me," Vera said one afternoon. "I know," Sylvie said. She was putting away bread and milk and the herbal tea Vera liked. "You brought Edmund bread and coffee for 30 years. You came up the mountain the day after I arrived and made me coffee and told me who he was." She closed the cabinet. "I'd still be scrubbing floors and wondering about the walls if you hadn't done that." Vera looked at her from the table. "You would have figured it out," she said. "Maybe a little slower. Maybe," Sylvie said, "but it would have been lonelier." Vera reached across the table and took her hand. Her grip was lighter than it had been in September. She held on for a moment. "Edmund had a saying," she said. He told me once, and I never forgot it because it was the only time I heard him say something that sounded like a conclusion about his own life. She looked at the window. Real inheritance isn't what they hand you, it's what they couldn't take away. Sylvie looked at their hands on the checked tablecloth. What couldn't they take from him, she said. His craft, Vera said. His patience, his love for the work. She smiled, and his stubbornness. They certainly could not take that. On a Tuesday in the third week of October, Sylvie hung a photograph on the cabin wall. She had been carrying it in her duffel bag since the day she left her apartment, a small frame photograph of Colt on their wedding day, standing in a rented suit with his collar slightly crooked because he had tied his own tie and slightly misjudged the length, grinning. The grin of a man surprised by his own happiness, which was Colt's particular gift. The capacity to be surprised by it even when he had arranged the circumstances himself. She hung it on the wall beside the shelf that held Edmund's tools, the copper rack with EH above each position. Two Harmons, the grandfather who had spent 30 years building something true, and the grandson who had understood it was true when he was 11 years old and had ridden a bus 3 hours to sit on a porch with the man who made it. The two people in that family who had seen what was worth seeing. She stood back and looked at both of them. You saw clearly, she said. Both of you. She kept a journal of her own now, not the way Edmund had kept his, not the technical documentation of a craftsman recording the work. Hers was simpler and less orderly. She wrote about the Saturday mornings and the students and the things Vera told her. She wrote about Colt, the things she remembered and the things she was afraid of forgetting. His laugh, the way he hummed while he cooked, the way he had never said a bad word about his family, even though he had known better than she had, exactly what they were. He had carried that knowledge quietly and had not let it make him mean, which was its own kind of craftsmanship. She wrote about Edmund. She wrote about what it meant to build something for an unknown person, to have that kind of faith in a future you would not see. She kept her journal in the cedar-lined drawer beside Edmund's, the two notebooks resting on the same cedar, breathing the same enclosed air. October came in cold and brilliant, the kind of cold that clarifies everything it touches. The leaves on the ridge turned and the valley below the cabin became something out of a painting that would have been called exaggerated if it were a painting all that red and amber and gold, laid out for miles in every direction. The tourists who drove the mountain roads on weekends read Holt's sign and came up the dirt road and stood in the clearing and looked at the cabin the way people look at something they did not expect to find. On a Saturday morning in the third week of October, Sylvie was at the workbench on the porch setting up the morning's lesson when she heard a car on the road. Not a familiar engine, not Ray's truck or Vera's wagon or any of the regular Saturday vehicles she had come to recognize by sound. This engine had a rough catch on the idle, the sound of a car being asked to do more than it was comfortable doing. It came around the last bend slowly, the driver unsure of the road or unsure of the destination, or both, and pulled into the clearing and stopped at the edge. The engine went quiet. The door opened. A young woman got out, 22, maybe 23. Dark hair pulled back from her face, a duffel bag over one shoulder, the strap worn thin at the buckle. She wore a jacket too light for the mountain cold of late October, the kind of choice you make when you pack for wherever you were going and not for wherever you end up. She stood beside her car and looked at the cabin with an expression Sylvie recognized completely because she had been the person with that expression not 4 months ago. Standing in a clearing, holding everything she owned, hoping that what she was looking at was real. Sylvie set down the chisel she had been arranging and walked to the edge of the porch. "Can I help you?" she said. The young woman shifted the duffel bag on her shoulder. "I read about this place," she said, "in an article." She paused. "About the cabin and the carvings and how it was given away." They stood there for a moment in the October air, the clearing bright around them. "You're early," Sylvie said. "Come on up." The young woman climbed the porch steps. She stopped in front of the carved front door, her hand going to the surface of the carving before she had decided to put it there, the leaves and vines pulling at something in her fingers the way they did with everyone. "Is this what he made?" she said. "This is the door," Sylvie said. "Everything inside is what he made." She opened the door and the young woman stepped in and stopped in the middle of the room and stood still, the way every person stood still. Her eyes went to the walls, to the mantel, to the hawk on the table that caught the morning light through the clean windows. Her hand was still raised slightly from touching the door, and she lowered it slowly. Why did he hide them? She said. Because the people who were supposed to love him decided he wasn't worth keeping, Sylvie said. So he spent 30 years building something for the person who came after. Someone he knew his family would throw away the same way they'd thrown him away. The young woman was quiet. She was looking at the hawk, but her expression said she was hearing something larger than the specific story she'd been told. Sylvie put a cup of coffee on the table. Sit down, she said. The chair is steady. Edmund made it. The young woman sat. She wrapped both hands around the cup and took a breath that was longer than an ordinary breath. Why didn't you sell? She said. The article said it was worth millions. Sylvie sat across from her. Because someone built all of this for a person he'd never meet, she said. She looked at the mantel, at the hawk, at Colt's photograph on the wall beside the row of hand-turned tools. She thought about the 6 words carved on the underside of a cherrywood drawer face. For the one they give it to. I want to do the same thing, she said. The young woman looked at her over the rim of the cup. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who has been calculating for a long time, running the numbers of how far she could get and what she could afford and whether anyone would help, and who is very tired of calculating. Can I stay? She said. Her voice was careful, the careful voice of someone who has learned to ask for things in ways that make it easy to be told no. Just a day or two. I can sleep in my car. I won't be any trouble. Sylvie looked at her. She thought about Edmund's letter. I made them for you. She thought about Vera walking over from her garden and pulling off one glove. She thought about Colt at 11 years old getting on a bus and riding 3 hours because there was someone on a mountain who saw him clearly, and he had understood even at that age that such people are not common and should not be wasted. There's a cot in the storage room, Sylvie said. It's warm. Stay as long as you need. The young woman's eyes filled. She blinked and looked down at her coffee and did not speak for a moment. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Sylvie said. Thank Edmund. He's the one who made sure there would be a place. That evening, after the young woman had eaten and washed her face and gone to sleep on the cot in the storage room Ray had built in August, Sylvie went out to the porch. The air was cold and sharp. The smell of fallen leaves and the particular dry cold of the high mountains in October, the cold that comes down from the ridge after dark and settles in the clearing. The sky above the tree line was full of stars in a way that you only see when you are far enough from any town that the light of human things doesn't reach the dark. She sat in her place, the place she always sat, her back against the railing. She pressed back until she could feel the letters through her jacket. C and E. The two of them. A boy who had understood something before he had the words for it, and an old man who had given him a porch and a view of the hawks and never asked for anything in return. Their initials on the underside of the wood where no one would find them unless they knew to look. Hidden the same way Edmund had hidden everything that mattered to him in places where only the right person with the right attention would find it. She pressed her palm flat against the rail. She thought about the day she had driven up this road for the first time. $47 in a brass key and a sticky note with an address. A cabin the county had valued at $3 and a family that had valued her at less than that. She had parked in this clearing and walked to this porch and put a key in a lock and pushed open a door, and what she had found behind it had changed every calculation she had been making about what came next. Edmund had known she was coming. Not her specifically, the shape of her. The shape of anyone his family would hand a key to like a dismissal and then forget. He had built for that shape across 30 years, 14 pieces wrapped in oilcloth, 4 journals, a letter, a lock that matched the key they would give away because they had no idea what the key opened. He had been patient in a way that was its own kind of power. Not the power of lawyers or trusts or the family machinery that runs on exclusion and silence. The power of someone who understands that time belongs to the careful, that what is made with precision and love and no hurry will outlast everything built on the assumption that the person you are discarding will simply disappear. The cabin was behind her. She could feel it. The solid mass of it, the true walls and the straight roof line, and the 60 years of mountain weather it had absorbed without shifting. The hawk on the table inside the one Edmund had carved in 1974 and wrapped in oilcloth and hidden in a fireplace, which had waited in the dark for nearly 50 years for someone to press the right stone. The rocking chair by the fire, the writing desk against the wall, the tools in their copper rack. Colt's photograph beside them. Everything that had waited, everything that held. She opened the last journal to the final entry, reading it in the starlight, and the faint warmth still rising from the cabin walls behind her. February of 2009. Edmund Harmon, 79 years old, his hands slower but still working, writing the last thing he would write in the journals. The cabin is finished, 14 pieces behind the walls. The drawer is sealed. The letter is written. I've done everything I can do. The rest is up to time. And to whoever finds this place, I hope they know what it means. Not the money. The money doesn't matter to me. I hope they know that someone saw them before they were born. Someone understood what was coming for them and built something to catch them when they fell. That's all I ever wanted to do. Build something that holds. She closed the journal. She held it in her lap for a moment and looked up at the stars above the ridge. Inside the cabin, the young woman was asleep on a cot in a room that had not existed 4 months ago. Vera was asleep 2 miles down the mountain. The hawk was on the table where the morning light would find it first thing, the same light that had been coming through those windows since 1962, through the dirty glass and now through the clean. The journals were in the cedar drawer beside the blue notebook she wrote in by lamplight after the students left on Saturdays. All of it together in one place. Edmund had built the whole of it on a single belief that the right person would come, that what he made and what he hid and what he wrote would find the person it was meant for, that the family who discarded both of them had not in the end determined anything that mattered. He had been right. She had come. She had pressed the stone. She had read the words on the underside of the drawer. She had opened the lock with the key they had given her like an insult, and she had found everything he had left behind. And she was still here on the porch, her back against the rail above the letters of a boy and his grandfather, who had known something true about each other in a family that didn't want to know. The wind came along the ridge in the cold October night and moved through the trees and pressed against the cabin walls. The walls did not move. They had been built by someone who understood that the measure of a thing is not what it's worth to the people who throw it away. The measure of a thing is whether it holds through 60 years of weather and indifference and the long patience of waiting for the right person to arrive. It held, and now it was hers.